Good morning, everyone, and thank you for both laying out the value proposition about what we're going to be talking about for the next half an hour, as well as putting the elephant on the table. We're not going to talk about the elephant at the table until the end of this panel, so don't worry. But we are going to talk about the value proposition and get some really important insights from the panel we have here. What I'm going to do is try and keep this going quickly so we can make sure that we have some time for audience participation. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer a short opening question for about a minute or two. We'll do some back and forth, open it up to the audience, and at the end we'll get some commentary on how we move forward. So with that, let me start with you, Michele. I'm going to go a little bit out of order. What we're talking about is how do we improve impact through results-oriented government. Can you give us a little bit of context about what we're talking about? How has the movement developed over the last 5 or 10 years? Kind of where are we? Just a little bit of ground level setting.
So as Dave said, I lead the organization called Results for America, which was started about 4.5 years ago. And the purpose is we are laser focused on changing policymaker behavior. To us, the most important way to increase the amount of evidence and data is to change the way policymakers make their decisions. And we are focused on getting them to care about using data every time there's a problem that they need to address, making sure that it's, one of the first things or the most important thing that they do is to consider what it is about what works and what it is about what the problem is that they're trying to solve. And so we do that through 3 primary ways. One is we are setting what we're calling a standard of excellence at the federal, state, and local level, and increasingly at the global level as well. So we can have policymakers see where it is that they need to go. Like, what does good look like if you create a government that will be able to use evidence and data effectively? So we're creating these standards of excellence. We're also building a bipartisan coalition, as Dave said. We are extremely disciplined about every time we engage a Democratic policymaker, we enlist a Republican as a pair in everything we do. We wrote a book, Moneyball for Government, which was partnered pairs of Republicans, Democrats, elected officials, appointed officials, people who are deeply partisan, but share the common, idea or value that we need to be using more and better information to get better results. And so this bipartisan coalition is, doing things like, this Moneyball for Government book. We're starting this What Works Media project, which is going to be having documentary films to better explain kind of what it is that we're talking about here in this room. And then, the third part of what we do is helping policymakers do what works then. And that's what Simone was talking about with our What Works Cities program, which is helping policymakers at all levels of government, coaching, providing matchmaking with partners who can help them get the work done better and to sort of accelerate what they're doing. And so we are, over the last 4 years have gotten a lot of momentum in the work that we're doing. But we're part of this larger ecosystem of people, of organizations, of policymakers, of officials who have, come to the realization, as Dave said so well, that the pie isn't getting any bigger. We've got to figure out ways to spend it better. And one way to do that, probably the most effective way to do that, is to spend dollars on things that work better. And that's not a partisan issue. That's just, common sense.
Excellent, thank you. Josh, let me go to you. So you're, like many of us in this room, obsessed with data and the value of it, but you're also someone who really spends a lot of time thinking about rigorous evaluation. It's not just the outcome. Why do we need to do that, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Right now, Dave did a great job of highlighting how we simply don't know enough about what works for whom and under what circumstances. We can use data, we can use data science to learn a little bit about what has happened in the past, but too often if we just employ those tools, we get fooled. There are lots of examples about this where we thought certain approaches worked, and it turns out they were either null, they had no effect, or they actually had a negative effect. So programs like Scared Straight, which everybody knew worked until we actually did an RCT. We employed rigorous evaluation and found out it was actually negative. It increased the rate at which these kids actually went back into the juvenile justice system. There are lots of examples like this in social science and medicine where simple data analysis, backward-looking data analysis, observational data analysis resulted in conclusions which were erroneous. So going forward, if we really want to learn more about what works, we have to employ our full set of tools to do that, including much more purposeful experimentation and rigorous evaluation prospectively to learn what works. The good thing is, where we are right now with data systems and infrastructure is much cheaper to do that than it used to be, and we're getting more sophisticated in employing those tools on a rapid cycle basis.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a minute about kind of examples of where you think those opportunities to do that are, but let me go to Caroline first. So Caroline, the panel's really about how can government do this better? And I want to ask you what your experience has been and what you think about what are the factors that help improve government's ability to actually do what we're talking about? How do we help them invest in what works, develop an outcome orientation, and build their muscles about really rigorous evaluation?
Thank you, Lenny. So at Third Sector, our mission is really to transform how government funds social services in this country. But as Michele mentioned, we're all part of this ecosystem and kind of taking off different pieces of that complicated puzzle. So for us, at Third Sector, we're really the implementers on the ground of what outcomes-based policy looks like, not just for government, but also in communities. As we found out some of the factors, everybody loves the idea of investing in outcomes, but it's really hard to actually operationalize it. And we found that there's a couple of factors that really kind of make the difference for our folks in counties and states, and for service providers, the nonprofits who are ultimately on the receiving end of this changing shift. And so the first one is really governance and policy, and Results for America does incredible work pushing forward bipartisan legislation to make investing in outcomes versus programs or just tracking outputs, heads and beds, to make that even a possibility, right? So there's a whole piece around governance and pushing forward positive policy that we sometimes influence with our experiences on the ground. The second is really technology, so one of the reasons we're here. And I think that, as Josh mentioned, we have an unprecedented opportunity right now with the advances in technology to actually have data to understand what's happening in our communities. We have a little bit of it from the past, but the most exciting part is what that could mean for the future. And so at Third Sector, what we do is we partner with folks like Stanford, David Greschke and Raj Chetty, to make sure that the technology, those databases they're integrating and those databases they're creating are relevant and actually deployable within communities so providers and governments can actually use that data to learn and to eventually reallocate some of their resources to those programs that are getting greater impact over time. And the last two are where we spend most of our time is we've realized, government spends $800 billion a year. Much of that goes out either in contracts to service providers for nonprofits, or it's delivered within government. And so the contracting capacity is a huge component of that. And at Third Sector, we work helping government to rewrite those contracts. What does it mean to write in this data and this use of outcomes within your contracting? Would you pursue pay for success or pay for performance approaches to change incentives in the relationships you have with providers and with the community to move towards increased outcomes over time? So that's an important piece. In addition to governance and technology and contracting, the biggest thing, and one that I feel like we at first forgot about, is capacity, right? What is literally time and energy within government and within communities to actually lean forward and say, yes, we want to put our neck out here, and we want to try something that's pretty darn risky for government, right? Trying something innovative has a risk of failure. Politics punishes failure. And so we spend a lot of our time at Third Sector doing that stakeholder inclusion, convincing folks in the provider community, and building the capacity of government officials to actually change how they do business.
That's terrific. Dave, I'm going to come back to you at the end since we want to make sure we maximize the time with our other panelists, no offense. Michele, so you've been at this for a while and have a real sense of how hard this is, but you also are continuing to stay at it. So what are the biggest challenges of scaling what we're talking about, and how do you think we're going to overcome those?
So can I go to the elephant in the room now?
You can do that.
So Dave already raised the elephant. I think there is, and this is not a partisan statement at all, which is there's this dangerous undercurrent in politics in this country as well as globally about that's ignoring facts and ignoring the truth. That happened in Brexit, that happened, other countries, so it's not unique to this country. I think we, at Results for America, are very focused on this as a sort of existential threat to what we are trying to do. we need to make sure that policymakers broadly don't buy into the idea that they're going to be rewarded for not paying attention to facts. And so we are launching a new sort of strategic communications campaign that's going to be focused on getting, rewarding policymakers who do use evidence and data to get success. We're going to be building a broader, significantly broader constituency for, evidence-based policymaking, data-driven solutions, recognizing that, we have 400 people in our coalition that are elected officials, former electeds, people at all levels of government, but that's 400 people who are all talking to themselves. We need to broaden the number of people who are committed to the idea that facts matter, that ultimately if government delivers better, people's lives are going to be better. And so we're broadening this coalition dramatically. And then we're going to also broaden our support for policymakers who are on the verge of sort of, thinking that this is important but don't exactly know how to do it, and partnering with all of the groups in this room to make sure that they have access to those who are most interested in making this change in terms of who the policymakers are. And so we are, at this time, as Jim said at the beginning, as David said, we think this is an incredibly important moment to continue to push and to sort of press on the gas pedal, and that we need to make sure that our policymakers do not retrench, do not learn some lesson that data doesn't matter, that evidence isn't going to make a difference, that we can continue to operate based on hunches and instinct as opposed to what we know about what works and what's really going to make a difference in people's lives.
Okay, thank you, Michele. Since you went there, I'm going to continue that stream. So in addition to teaching at Stanford, one of the things I do is I co-chair California Forward, which is a bipartisan group in California looking at outcomes that work. And I have the pleasure of working with, I'm the Democratic chair, I have the pleasure of working with the Republican co-chair, Pete Weber, who's in the room someplace. And in addition to agreeing on 95% of what we're putting out there, one of the things that's fun is the opportunity to see what's actually working on the ground. And Pete's one of those, of what he's doing in Fresno and trying to bring children out of poverty in the poorest zip code in California. And so, Josh, how do we make examples like what Pete's doing and what California Forward is doing more of the norm rather than the exception? How do we get government to really care about learning what works, using evidence, and not starting with, I have an ideological point of view about what the answer is?
It's a great question, and I agree with Michele that this is a pivotal moment here. Every time I hear somebody from DC talk now, there's a huge amount of depression in their voice, especially those who want to base things on data and evidence. But I will say, I think that you've highlighted a big point of opportunity. The feds have always been disconnected with what's actually happening on the ground in state and local governments. This is not a giant switch in the past. I think the force with which the new administration will distance themselves from reality is probably big, but we haven't exactly had a Congress that knows what's going on down at the local level for quite some time. State and local leaders want to do good things. They are in the business of not just bragging about things that they've accomplished or scoring political points. They actually have to deliver services in a more real way than a lot of federal government officials have to. They're searching for solutions. They desire solutions. They get this stuff. They would hear us talking on this panel, and they would realize that if they really want to deal with the real problems their state and local governments face, their communities face, inside their current budget constraints, they're going to have to adopt better practices on the data and evidence side to get more efficient and more effective. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think that you hit the nail on the head. Your question was basically, how do we lift those examples up? I think we just do it. I think that the federal government is going to devolve, is likely to devolve significant authority down to the state and local level, probably more than in past years. And given that there is huge interest at the state and local level, I think there's a huge opportunity for us at this moment to really employ and show the power of evidence-based policy at that level. And we need examples like Fresno to hold up and say, here's what we can accomplish if we actually do this and do this well.
Okay, Carolyn, one last question for the panel, and then I'm going to open it up for a little bit of question, and a lightning round, and Dave, you can do that. So, Caroline, we're 2,500 miles away from Washington here. You're on the ground doing stuff that's actually working. How do we do what you're doing times 10? What's it going to take to accelerate the investment that's done so that government really does all of the things that it's best it can do?
So when I hear the word accelerate, I'm also reminded of what Josh said, which is a lot of this work happens at the state and local level. So accelerating, there's things we can do in Washington to influence, but ultimately we're gonna have to increase and accelerate the uptake at the state and local level to do this work. And as Josh also mentioned, the primary job of state and local governments is to deliver services, deploy that 800 million. And so that's their first primary objective. So all this other cool stuff and things they want to be doing, the intent is there, but there's a time and money problem in a bunch of different flavors for them to actually move and accelerate the shift. And so I think that on the time side, it's just buying the decision maker time within state and local government to be able to think differently, think about outcomes, and be willing to invest the political capital. It's both their energies, but the political capital to try out something new. And then on the money side, I think this is where DC really comes in, and philanthropy, is that you need money of a couple different flavors. You need to provide the money to help these local governments to test. You need to provide the money to help these governments transition, right? It's not just about doing one project. How do you shift the mindset within state and local government that they can use data in an ongoing way to learn and improve service delivery over time? And then really this is where DC gets in. You need to make it politically palatable. You need to reward outcomes. There need to be funding streams that actually go out from DC to state and local government that give state and local officials cloud cover to say, hey, if I go out on a limb and I try this new innovative approach of investing in outcomes, I will be rewarded for success, and I'm not going to be punished so harshly for failure that I never want to try it again. That's what I think the federal government can do, is really create systems and structures that would reward people that go out and think about investing in outcomes in new ways, so we can accelerate the state and locals that take up this work.
Okay, fantastic. So I wrote a piece on Medium yesterday called Make America Great, the Answer is Us. And I really don't like having talking heads telling everyone else in the room what to do. So I'd like to open it up to us, to ask questions, comments, observations for a few minutes, and then I'll give each of our panel a lightning round closing observation. So who's got a question or comment? And there's microphones running around. Tom. And please say your name and who you are.
I'm Tom, and I'm here from the government, and I'm here to help you. So I had a question about the politics of this. And one of the things that we struggled with is we would go up to the Hill and talk about, our tiered evidence grant making and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the issues we ran into is that our Constitution gives 2 senators to states that have 38 million people in them and states that have, 1 million and change in them. And so there was a lot of concern in those states that if we shifted money from block and formula funding, when they knew how much money they were going to get, to a competitive system, there was a concern that fancy coastal elites would get all the money and they wouldn't get money if it was competitively allocated. So how do we deal with the issue, which is that the amount of money that we're using to build and use evidence relative to the formula programs, the block grant programs, and I would argue the tax expenditures, is just a rounding error right now. What will it take to change the politics of that issue?
Okay, Tom, by the way, thank you flying back and forth every week for 8 years from California to Washington to help push that forward. So who wants to tackle that one?
Tom is known at the White House for asking the hard questions. I think at this moment in time, there's a lot of reason to be looking at and thinking about small states by population, rural communities, and the resources that they're getting. I know at the White House we worked a lot with the rural team and held multiple events and introduced new grant programs to help rural communities better build and make use of evidence. It is not an easy challenge. One of the advantages of smaller communities is that while evidence and data are important, taking a human-centered approach and crossing silos and taking on the full challenges, helping individuals who are struggling get the access to services they need to take on the full challenges in their lives, is often better accomplished in smaller communities where silos don't have such big, thick walls and where people know each other better. And I think, the focus really needs to be on getting better outcomes holistically for people. And we probably do need some protection so that let's say that a small state knows that it is not going to lose all of its resources. And we're seeing lots of really positive approaches to that, so that you're holding, for instance, a jurisdiction whole, but creating guidelines and rules that incentivize that jurisdiction, that state, to shift resources to the things that are working best and to continually improve. And I think that might be a way to increase the political palatability.
Josh, you have go ahead, Michele and Josh.
So just two other things too so our What Works Cities program focuses on cities between 100,000 and 1 million people. And so 100,000 is relatively small, but it's still, there's a whole swath of cities and counties that we, and with our work, do not touch at all. And so in sort of this phase 2 push that we're gonna make to broaden the constituency of leaders who will be committed to outcomes, to use of evidence and data, we're going to be going to these smaller communities and in more rural areas. Both because it's the right thing to do. When I'm a Midwesterner, I live in a small town, as Tom has Midwestern roots, knows, the politics of resentment in Wisconsin is one of the things that, sort of helped change the election, and that was a very rural, phenomenon. But beyond that, I think with our city and the fact that we have a very urban focus, this is just not a good dynamic that it's been going on for decades, for centuries, is this urban, rural dynamic. But as the pie is not getting any bigger, making sure that we at least can have this common language, this common understanding that, we're all trying to at least base our decisions on the best information that we have, on facts and on evidence. I think that will help to bridge some of this urban-rural divide.
Okay, Josh and then Caroline.
Yeah, so to echo some of these points, these programs are meant to incentivize the creation and use of evidence, not necessarily to incentivize competition between states for the same dollars. I think we could use a whole lot more incentivization of the use and creation of evidence, and you can hold these states harmless. I'm from one of these small states, Arkansas, and you could hold them harmless while still providing them with the capability and the incentive to do this. I will also say that it doesn't take huge amounts of money to move the needle on this stuff. Race to the Top is a great example of how a small amount of money relative to the overall size of the pie shifted policy in a big, big way. So I don't think we should get discouraged that, we're not shifting that much of the money. I think the tiered evidence initiatives and building that into programs has had a huge impact, an outsized impact for the size of these grants that we've actually issued.
Great. Caroline, and then there's a question over here that I'll go to next.
Just to reiterate, I really do believe it's all about incentives, and it's not just the presence of positive incentives, but it's minimizing the negative incentives to go out and to test. So protecting the dollars that are already there while giving them an opportunity and incentivizing them to do more. And I also think it's a little, just as Josh said, it's a little bit of a supply and demand issue. We've actually found that there's been some major enabling legislation for pay for performance, whether it's Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or Every Student Succeeds Act, and now potentially upcoming in some formula funds. It's not a huge amount of money, but there's a little bit of supply there that I think we need to show with state and local governments that there's a demand to use that little bit of flexibility that's there, and then tell those stories, right? Show that there's local workforce boards using WIOA for pay for performance, and then making the case that more of that funding should be allocated in that way. But right now we're in the testing period where people have put out the supply, and it's our job, whether it's third sector or everyone in this room, to make sure people are taking advantage of the flexibility with evidence-based approaches and outcomes funding, so we can show that the demand is there to bring back to DC.
Great. There's a question over here. And please say who you are.
Hi, Scott Schweitzberg. My question is about kind of what you were talking about with the negatives piece. Is it seems like the sort of politics of outrage sort of gets in the way of lots of really good, messy things between now and when we actually get a lot of this evidence and outcomes. And it seems like you can take anything and make it sound bad, right? So like today, there was a report in the New York Post that about wasteful government spending and the fact that we spent $180,000 to find a new way to track ducks. I have no idea if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I know that the Post was very clear that that's horrible and a great example of waste. So my question is, what are how do we get around this need to turn everything, and to your point, the 5% of things that fail or the 95% of things that fail will always be used as tools of our own destruction. So are there ways to even just remove humans from the process entirely, or remove all of us and just say, we're just gonna set up a computer, just gonna do this, and there's no one to blame? Like, how do we get out of the blame and outrage cycle that we've basically created for ourselves?
Okay, let's try that. I'm not sure I want to start with your answer in Silicon Valley, but go ahead.
Well,
Ross,
so Jim Shelton, was very modest at the beginning, talking about his insight with, things with a little bit of evidence, get a little bit of money, things. But that actually set in motion a huge wave of activity throughout agencies in the U.S. government just to change that mindset and to make competitive programs, incorporate that idea that if you have a little bit of evidence, you get a little bit of money, you have a lot of evidence, you get a lot of money, and it kind of rippled throughout government. That had nothing to do with the political process. And it was exactly what you're saying. It was sort of removing it from people who are making political decisions, not in an anti-democratic small d way, but in a we now are at the point where hard decisions have to get made, and this is a better way than putting it out to the press and the sort of fake news world, and so Jim was modest, but it had a huge effect over the last 8 years on creating the muscle in government and making it feel like this is possible and we can do this and we can start to shift this big tanker that is government.
Okay, other ideas?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes I'm given a pep talk. I think it's very easy to get discouraged by some of the national rhetoric that we're seeing. But I don't think it's all that influential actually on the ground. State and local leaders that I talk to, people that are engaged in this work, really want to find solutions. They're not just looking to score political points because they've got a budget and they've got stuff to do and people to help. And so I think that regardless of what's happening at the national level and some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, we've made huge progress over the last 8 years plus. Going back into the Bush administration. And I think that there's more enthusiasm today for these types of approaches than ever before. There's more infrastructure to actually pull this off than ever before. And so I don't want us to get too caught up in rhetoric. If we get too caught up in rhetoric, the people using that rhetoric in a way have won. And it's time for us to take control of this situation and actually do some stuff on the ground that proves the power of the approach.
Excellent. Caroline. Well said.
I think while I am totally a cheerleader 99% of the time, I will also say that the reality that politics punishes failure is very real for most folks who are trying to get reelected at some point. Now, there's a difference between the elected and the agency heads. And so I think what I will say that we've learned over time, and it's been a tough one for me, is patience. And that it's not going to be a light switch, folks. We're not going to move all of the $800 billion to be outcomes oriented next year. It's just not going to happen. And that could be a good thing, because one of our greatest fears when we get up in the morning is that if that happened, and then we know that right now a lot of things don't work, our fear is that folks would then say, see, look, after 1 year, none of this works, we need to dismantle the whole thing. And that, I think, is one of the big risks that a lot of times we don't talk about this movement, and that I think, as we confront this anger and rage, the rhetoric, put that aside, do the work, and do it in a way that is a progressive transition versus a light switch approach. Because if you're making a wholesale, switch out, then that gives, frankly, more opportunity for the outrage and for the possibilities for dismantlement. But when you feather in a transition, when you feather in those positive incentives and you minimize the negative ones, and you reward people financially and in the press for making that progress and that learning, that's when I think we'll have the sustained progress. So it's not sexy and it's not exciting. It's not as exciting as flipping a light switch and living in a brave new world, but it's the reality that I think we live in with our government.
Excellent, thanks, Caroline. Some of us find hard work that takes time sexy and exciting as well. That's including most of the people in this room. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to do a quick lightning round. And I see someone in the back. Speaking of someone who actually gets stuff done, Pete Weber.
Hi, I'm Pete Weber, and I am the Republican co-chair of California Forward, and I am the founder and chair of the Fresno Bridge Academy. Started in 2010, has been producing excellent results in moving people out of poverty. I have a question, certainly really for all of you. And the question is, how do we accelerate progress in terms of outcomes-based government? A couple of you, Dave and Caroline, mentioned Moneyball for Government, 2014, written by Peter Orszag and Jim Nussle, and a bunch of other people from across the political spectrum that showed that we really are not, governing based on outcomes. As Dave mentioned, 1% of what we do is tracked to outcomes. And I would agree with Caroline that we don't want to go to 100%, in 1 year. It's not a light switch process. It is a progressive process. But boy, do we need to make movement. I mean, can we set a plan where at least 25% of what we do is outcomes-based within 4 years? And I say that knowing that the Bush administration attempted this, the Obama administration attempted this, and frankly, it didn't go very far. Because, if this was halftime of a football game and you were looking at, outcomes-based reform versus the status quo, the score would be 98-3. The status quo wins most of the time. And it's understandable why this would happen. I mean, all of these social programs, the $800 billion that Dave referred to, represents 92 federal poverty programs, all of which originated in a committee of the Congress that had very narrow jurisdiction and that was very concerned about duplication of effort, constrained the hell out of the program. And to go to Caroline's comment, people at local agencies are very concerned. Their incentive system is not to be in violation of the rules that affect those programs, instead of focused on outcomes. And so how do we break through? What do you all suggest in terms of breaking through? And let me just end with this. We have a program in Fresno that is now spread to 4 other counties, and within a year, it'll be in at least 8 California counties, that is taking people who are SNAP beneficiaries and lifting them out of poverty. Within 18 months, 81.5% have materially increased their income, 75% enter unemployed and are employed by the end of the program. 83% remain in their jobs a year later. 30% have achieved full self-reliance within just 18 months. And yet, this program is minimally funded. The FDA program that funds this, called the Food Nutrition Services Agency, has an $82 billion budget. And last year, they allocated $290 million, about 1/3 of 1%, to programs like this.
Okay, Pete, great question. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and say, can each of you answer that question in one way or another in your closing remarks with the point of how do we accelerate this movement going forward? Your thoughts in 1 minute or less. And in particular, how do we get Silicon Valley to engage in this as opposed to saying it's Washington's problem?
Well, so I think that being here in Silicon Valley, a lot of the companies here employ evidence-based approaches to their own businesses. They have built the infrastructure necessary, the data infrastructure, the capacity on the research side, the management structures to value outcomes, to measure outcomes, and to adjust to put dollars towards things that deliver outcomes. So I think Silicon Valley is a perfect place to talk about this. The way we accelerate this work is to build that infrastructure in more places. Governments can't do this alone. Academics have been quite disconnected, frankly, from things that actually happen on the ground and engage only in an ad hoc way often with their communities. I think we just need to tie those things much more closely together and create that infrastructure to routinely create and use evidence at the local level, much the same way that Silicon Valley companies do in their own businesses.
Fantastic. Michele.
Very well said. I agree 100% with Josh. I'll just add that I think there's also an element of political will that we need to continue to foster and build, both Democrats and Republicans. We at Results for America are focused, like a laser on what are the carrots, what are the sticks, what are the incentives to get policymakers to either pay attention to the evidence and data, to be, not rewarded when they don't, and to celebrate them when they do, and to also point sort of a direction for them. And that we have this federal What Works, Invest in What Works index that looks at 8 different federal agencies and it gives them 10 criteria that outlines sort of what it is that the federal government agencies need to have in place in order to, build and use evidence better. And so we've called on the next administration. The agencies are about 80% there. We've called on the next administration to get 100% there. It's absolutely doable. I mean, this is not hard stuff. They could do it, and this is stuff, some of it Congress needs to be involved. But it's not even aspirational anymore. This is stuff that they can do. And so we're, calling on the administration to do that. And that in itself will make a big difference. But I think the political will to us is absolutely a key lever on top of the infrastructure.
Great. Caroline and then Dave, you get the last word.
I think starting from the ground, you need local and state governments that have the time and the money to dedicate to testing these approaches and really learning from what works. Then you need to realize that the money that they spend to deliver services every year is an opportunity. Each contract that they spend is an opportunity to align resources with results. And so helping them to have the capacity to take advantage of that opportunity and connecting them, particularly in Silicon Valley, with the data infrastructure to underwrite outcomes in those contracting is going to help us give examples from the ground that then ultimately you've got to take it back to Washington. You've got to create the demand from the local level to put on policymakers that state and local governments want funding this way. They want it done, and you have to take advantage of the supply where you can get it, small things like Race to the Top, or even bigger enabling legislation in block funding grants to say that governments have the flexibility to fund for outcomes over time.
Fantastic. Dave, you have the final word, and then I'm going to say something and ask you to thank the audience.
Great. Thank you, Lenny. We're facing a radically different policy landscape and political landscape. But as Pete mentioned, the next administration is still inheriting a government that primarily pays for outputs and compliance rather than outcomes and impact. What I think is interesting and what so many people on this stage have contributed to in the real world, and Jim Shelton wrote a paper about creating an outcomes mindset in government. We're still in the early days for that, but once you catch that outcomes bug, you can't uncatch it. And that's kind of an exciting thing, and it will be enabled at the state and local level. What we don't have yet, but what we're working on and making progress on, is the enabling infrastructure that enables local and state government to act on and fund for outcomes, as Caroline was referring to. So we've come a long way, we have a long way to go, and there is a particular reason that we are here in Silicon Valley at the end of this administration where I feel like we have planted a lot of seeds. We have a long way to go in building this infrastructure. And if you think of this town, we talk about user-centered and data-driven approaches that have technologists at the table from the beginning. Well, this community has built an industry based on those principles. And I also think that this community is ready to step up in its business, in its philanthropy, to take an intentional and vocal stand on inequality specifically, addressing the issue of inequality specifically. Someone talked about outrage and how we can get caught up and not know sort of what's the right answer. I think in addition to the business approaches, in addition to the philanthropy, Silicon Valley and the tech community also has a unique voice that is credible in a very partisan environment that is seen as nonpartisan and means business. I think it's the right community I think that this is the right moment for this community to stand up and use its voice, philanthropy, and talent, and be very intentional about creating a big tent, taking on all the issue areas, applying these principles to all the issue areas so that we can continue to build and accelerate on this path forward.
That's fantastic, David. I'm trying to keep us on schedule. I just want to say that you've got a little sample from our audience, from our panel of between Josh, Michele, Caroline, and Dave, of people who are genuinely, as a Star Wars geek that I am, data Jedi Knights. And they are fantastic, but you are all part of the Rebel Alliance. Can the Rebel Alliance give a big round of applause for our Jedi Knights?